To another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're coming back at you with some more VMware. That's right, VMware Certified Professional version 6. This is actually a part 2. I know what you're thinking out there. We let Don talk way too much in part 1, so without further ado, Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing swell, Wes. So we left off talking about the distributed resource scheduler, and we got it configured, we got it set up, and we have it running, and technically we're done. If we just want the DRS to do its thing, balance out our workload, it's going to do it, right? It's set up and it's well enabled to do it. Maybe we put it in manual mode. So now we pick when it does what it does, right? But as far as what it does, it's kind of up to it. You certainly can leave it that way. But there's things that you know about your environment that DRS doesn't know. And so there's decisions DRS might make that are actually not good for your environment. And it's up to you to teach it. So there are some things we need to get in there to do to tweak the way that DRS works to make it work the right way for our environment, to get the most optimal performance possible. Because that's what DRS is all about, is performance. So what we're going to mess with in this episode is what's called affinity. When you create a cluster, right? If you remember way back in the first cluster episode we did, I created a cluster and I had a virtual machine in that cluster. And I said how by default, if one of the nodes were to fail, the virtual machine wouldn't actually flip over. It's kind of married to that one host. I would have to manually restart it on the other host. Unless I had configured vSphere HA or vMotion and all the other stuff, then you start to get that functionality. But in a basic cluster, each VM is kind of married to the node that you put it on. Now, that's called affinity. You have an affinity, an affection for one particular server or host over the others. Well, in DRS, we don't necessarily have that anymore. Now, DRS decides where you're going to be. And so my web server might be on host 3 right now. And by the end of the day, it might be on host 7. And when I come into work in the morning, it might be on host 2. It'll bounce around based on what's out there. And if I have a virtual machine that's turned off, when I go to power the virtual machine on, where does it end up? Well, who knows where, right? Let me show you what I mean. When I created a virtual machine, if you go back and watch the clustering episode, I went to create a virtual machine, and I right-clicked on the cluster, and I went to New Virtual Machine and started the Virtual Machine Wizard. I said I was going to create a new virtual machine from nothing. And it asked me where I wanted to put it. I wanted to put it in my data center. And then it asked for my compute resource. And on the compute resource screen, if I can get to it. I got to give it a name. All right, so this will be Web 02. So the arrow was off the top of my screen. I couldn't see it. There we go. In that episode, I chose the cluster, and I got an error. And the error said that the cluster did not have DRS enabled, and so I had to pick a host. I had to expand the cluster and pick a host, and I picked host 01, right? That's what we did back in that episode because we didn't have DRS. Now that I have DRS, I can pick the cluster. See, I'm not getting an error. Compatibility check succeeded. I can attach it to the cluster itself, not to a host. That's neat. Well, because I can now add new hosts to the cluster, and this virtual machine can bounce around to any of them. Doesn't matter, right? If I bind it to host 01, and then later on I use vMotion to move it to host 3, and I delete host 01, the next time I shut that virtual machine down and boot it back up, it's going to try and boot from host 01, and host 01 doesn't exist anymore, so it's going to be unhappy about that. I'm going to get errors. It will boot off another host, but it'll throw a bunch of errors. But with DRS, I can attach it to the cluster. And I can say, hey, when you boot up, I don't care where you go. Just grab a host in the cluster. And, to make sure we're optimal, DRS might give you different instructions. And DRS will. DRS will say, okay, you're booting up, and you're over here on host 03, and let me move you to host 05. It's got some better resources available, right? DRS will get involved. So it's neat that we can do that. We can attach it to the cluster. And now as we add hosts and remove hosts from the cluster, that's fine. And this functionality is really cool for standalone virtual machines. So virtual machines that are independent, this works out really well, okay? But what if I have virtual machines that aren't independent? What if they work together, right? Actually, there's a few different examples here. Let me give you a happy example and a sad example. We'll go all emotional in this episode. So a happy example. Let's say I have two virtual machines that really work together. I'm going to finish creating this web server real quick. actually, you know, it's probably faster just to clone my existing web server. So let me take this existing web server and I'm going to clone it. When I go to clone my web server, I'm going to clone it to a virtual machine. I'll call it Web02. And it's going to ask me where to put it. And I can come in, and for the compute resource, I can pick the cluster, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick the cluster, and then I'll finish that up. It can go right into shared storage. I'm not going to customize it, and we'll finish that up. There. Okay. So I've got two virtual machines, Web01 and DB01. All right. One's a web server, one's a database server. Let's say I'm running WordPress. With WordPress, you have a web page. That's the front end your clients see. And then the web page reaches back and gets all of its data from a database server, probably MySQL. So I've got a database server and a web server, and the two talk to each other. Now, when they're both on the same host, if both of these guys are on host 01, then they can talk to each other right through the hypervisor on that host. How much bandwidth do we have on the hypervisor? Tons and tons of bandwidth. You will get a very rapid, very quick communication, and you'll easily have a gigabit or more of communication bandwidth to be able to talk between the database and the web server. They'll run nice and fast. Okay. What if the web server was on host 01 and the database server was on host 02? Now I can't talk directly through the hypervisor. Now I've got to go to my physical network adapter, jump over the network to the other host and go in. And not only am I using the physical network adapter that caps me at a gigabit or 10 gig or whatever type of adapter I have, I also have contention. There's other people that are using that network adapter, and so I don't necessarily have full exclusive access to it. So my performance is going to degrade a bit. Not bad. I mean, there's plenty of people that have a database server and a web server on a network already, so it's not like it's worse than the old model. But it's not as good as it could be if I was taking advantage of hypervisor communications, right? So I kind of want these two. I want the database server and the web server, these two guys here, I want them to be on the same host. But with DRS, I can't guarantee that. DRS might move the database server to one host and the web server to another. So I want to influence that. And the way we influence it is if you choose your cluster and you go to Manage and then Settings. Inside of your settings, we've got vSphere HA, right, which is where we set up high availability, and we've got vSphere DRS where we turn that on, but we don't get anything in there that lets us manipulate how it functions. If you scroll down, though, in the settings, you'll find somewhere in here, there they are, VM host groups and VM host rules, all right? In ESXi 5.5 and earlier, and in vCenter 5.5 and earlier, these were called DSR host groups and DSR host rules. They've renamed them in 6.0, so now they're called VM host groups and VM host rules. These are how we can manipulate the way that DRS functions. And we can tell it, keep these virtual machines together or split these virtual machines apart. Right? We have positive affinity and negative affinity. Positive is we want to keep them together. Negative is we want to split them up and don't let them stay next to each other. So so we can start to set that up. It's like the opposite of affinity. We need to split them apart. Let me give you an example. That would be our sad example, right? So a happy example, I want to keep them together. Database 01 and Web 01, I want to keep them together. What about Web 01 and Web 02? Well, what if I add a second web server? And the whole reason for having that second web server is redundancy. I want to make sure that if one web server goes down, the other one is still up and I can keep my system online, right? Or if I'm load balancing for performance, I want to eke some extra performance out, so I add a second web server. Well, if both of the web servers are on the same host and the host fails, what's going to happen? Both web servers have to reboot. I don't want those web servers on the same hardware. I want one web server on host 1, and I want one web server on host 2. That way, if host 1 fails, yeah, that web server is going to have to reboot. But the web server running over on host 2, still okay, still up and running, it's happy. Okay? I want to keep them apart. So sometimes we want to keep VMs together, sometimes you want to keep VMs split apart, and these are the rules that let us define that. Right? So in my settings, I'm going to go down to my VM host groups. And in the VM host groups, here's where I can start to create definitions of hosts, right? And so I can come in here and I can add a group, and I might call this my my WordPress app, right, or whatever. So I've got an application called WordPress, and these are going to be ones that I want to keep together, right? So my Web 01 and Database 01. So I'm going to create that, and when I create it, it asks me for a type, and you can pick between a VM group or a host group. I'm going to go with a VM group. A host group is a collection of ESXi boxes. I might have a 16-node cluster, but I want to keep my database servers on these 4 nodes, and my web servers on these other 4 nodes. Why would I do that? Well, maybe some of my nodes have better fiber channel adapters or 10 gig Ethernet adapters, and other nodes only have 1 gig Ethernet adapters. And so I want my network intensive stuff to be on the nodes that have the better network adapters, so I can create host groups that define those. Here's a host group called 10 gig Ethernet. Here's a host group called 1 gig Ethernet. And now when I balance this stuff, I can put them in the appropriate group so they get those resources. This is, again, me influencing the affinity and how DRS makes its decisions. But I'm doing a VM group here in my WordPress app. And I'm going to add, and I'm going to go through and pick Web 01 and DB 01. I'm going to group them together so that I can tell it, hey, keep these guys together. I want them together at all times, right? And so I'll say OK, and now I've got that group. I'm going to create another group, which I'll call my web servers, right? So I'm just going to call this one web servers, and it's another VM group, and I'll go in here and add, and I'm going to add Web 01 and Web 02. Okay, and in reality, I'd add all my web servers that were part of this redundant web environment. And I'm going to use that group to split them apart. Okay, but here I'm just creating groups. The groups don't actually do anything. I can create groups to my heart's content, and DRS is just going to ignore them, right? So a group by itself is useless. I have to add rules to make it actually do something, right? So I can continue to add more groups based on whatever it is I want, and a VM and a host can be in more than one group, right? So I might have a group called 10 gigabit Ethernet, right? And so I come in and I take any host that has 10 gig Ethernet adapters and I put them in here. So maybe it's just host 01. And so I'm going to throw that one in there. Host 01 is now in the 10 gig Ethernet group. And then I create another host group. And this one is going to be 1 gigabit Ethernet. All right, so these are ones that have like lower bandwidth. And I might choose to add host 01 to this also. I know host 01 has 10 gig adapters, but it can certainly handle a gig if they have 10 gig adapters. So maybe I put it in there also, right? So I group those together. So it's in more than one group. And now, when I start picking where certain VMs go, I can influence that. I might do the same thing for, maybe I have some boxes that have 8 gig fiber channel adapters, and some boxes that only have 4 gig fiber channel adapters, or ancient 2 gig ones, or whatever. So now I can start balancing based on those resources. I know that. DRS doesn't. What's DRS looking at? CPU and memory, right? That's really what it's looking at. Well, let's think CPU. Maybe I've got some boxes that have Xeon processors in them and higher L2 cache. And I have other boxes that have i7s in them and a lower amount of L2 cache. Well, DRS is looking at CPU utilization, not necessarily are we using all the L2 cache available or whatever. So again, I can create groups based on that, and I can keep certain VMs within those groups to get that optimal performance.
All right, now, Don, you created those groups. You said the groups by themselves don't do anything, so it sounds like we got to throw in a few rules, right?
Yeah, and the rules are the most important part. In fact, there's even sometimes where you could skip the groups entirely and just go and configure the rules and manually pick individual VMs. It gets a little harder to manage that way because every time you add VMs, you got to go in and configure them again. But the rules are really important, so we need to dive in and get those configured. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to jump down here to rules. And I don't have any rules by default, which means all that work I did with groups is really kind of pointless unless I come in here and leverage them. Now, when you go to create a rule, there's actually 3 different types of rules. So when you go to create one, it's going to ask you to pick a name and then pick which type of rule you make. Okay. Now, the rules, they each kind of serve a different purpose. All right. The first one is keep virtual machines together. I'm going to specify particular virtual machines that I want to stay together. That's positive affinity. I want them grouped together. Like my WordPress app, I want DB01 and Web01 to be together. Or I can specify virtual machines that I want to keep apart. I want to separate virtual machines. This would be negative affinity. I want to separate these guys. This would be like Web01 and Web02. I don't want those 2 guys on the same hardware. I want them split up. Now, when I do these, because it's specific virtual machines, when I pick that and go to add an entry, you're going to notice how I don't get my groups. It's the individual virtual machines that are showing up. And the reason is the groups come into play with the third type of rule, virtual machines to hosts. And so when we're working with groups, we're normally going to pick the third rule. But let's just, as a quick example, work through the first two, and then I'll hit the third one after that. So keep virtual machines together. I want DB01 and Web01 together. So all I have to do is down here and add and pick Web01 and DB01. And when I say OK, the rule says the listed virtual machines must be run on the same host. Notice that must. They must be run on the same host. It will keep DB01 and Web01 together no matter what. All right? Even if performance gets really nightmarish, it's going to keep them together because we're enforcing that rule. All right? And so I'm going to call this my WordPress app, my database and web front end, and I'll save that. Okay? Then I'm going to create another rule for my web servers. And my web servers, I want to keep them apart. So I want to say my web servers keep virtual machines separated, or separate virtual machines. And I'm going to add that in. And again, I'm not going to see the groups. I'm going to see the individual VMs. And so I can go through and check them off. I'm going to pick Web01 and Web02 and save it. All right? And it's going to say the listed virtual machines must be run on separate hosts. It's going to separate them out. It will never let Web01 and Web02 run on the same host. Now, there's a problem there, isn't there? If host 01 fails, and host 02 is my only other host, and Web 02 is already running on host 02, Web 01 will not be able to come up on host 02, because then Web 01 and Web 02 would be together, right? And I just created a rule that said don't allow that. So in a small cluster, in a 2-node cluster, you can really run into problems with a rule like this. In a 16-node cluster, it's not a big deal, right? You just jump to another system. But if I have 16 nodes, and 16 web servers, and I have a rule created here with all 16 web servers, then no web server will ever be able to jump to another host because they're all being isolated. They're all being separated like this, right? So I need to plan for that, understand my capacities. These rules are not very flexible. That must word is kind of important, all right? Which leads us to the third type of rule, which is the one that's a little more useful, okay? With the third type of rule, if I go here and go into my VM host rules and I hit add, and I choose the third type of rule, virtual machines to hosts. When I choose that, now I get my groups that come back up, okay? And now I can start to pick things that are a little more flexible, right? I'm not necessarily tying to one particular host or forcing things as completely separate, but I'm tying them to groups. And I can come in and I can say that these are systems that must run on particular hosts, that should not run on particular hosts, that should run on host in a group or not run on host in a group. I've got my choices. And notice that terminology, must versus should. Okay, must. If I choose must, it's really not any different than the rules we just saw. But should gives me flexibility. It says try and keep them separate. But if you can't, it's okay to break the rule. And that's almost always what I want. And so in real life land, it is a rare day that I create the first two types of rules that we saw, right? So I'm just going to go in and delete these guys because that's not something I like to work with. Instead, we're going to do the other type, which lets us do shoulds, okay? So I'm going to delete those and I'm going to need to refresh. Oh, nope, it did it for me, good. So I'm going to add new rules. And this time I'm going to create a WordPress app rule. And I'm going to choose that third option, virtual machines to hosts. And for the virtual machine group, I'm going to pick my WordPress app. And hosts should run on host in a group or should not run on host in a group. I can say they should run on host in a group, and I can pick a group. Now, if I want them to be together, then I could pick a group that just had one host in it, and it will keep them on that host, and it will keep them together. But it's using the should terminology. Now, I made a 10 gig Ethernet group, and the 10 gig Ethernet group only had one host in it. It just had host 01. So now, my WordPress app, Web01 and DB01, will be together and will be on host 01. But if something happens to host 01, we can move somewhere else, and we can split them up if need be. Now they've got the flexibility to be split up versus the other rule that wouldn't let them be split up, right? And I've got it tied to a particular host. I might not necessarily want it tied to a particular host, and then I can go to the other option. With this type of rule, it's a lot easier to work with. With this rule, I could have left it the old way, and they would have run together on either host 01 or host 02. But on my web server rule, that's where I really had a problem. was those guys, they were going to get stuck based on the way they were. So in that case, I could come through and define alternate rules. You kind of have to plan your groups and plan your rules around that. So what I can do, for example, is let's address the web servers. So maybe with the WordPress app, I'm a little more strict, right? So let me put that rule back to the way it was. I'm going to be really strict about my WordPress app. I always, under all circumstances, I always want DB01 and Web01 to be together. So I say my WordPress app is going to be a keep virtual machines together rule. They must stay together. And so I'm going to add Web01, DB1, those two guys must stay together. I'm going to put that rule into play, okay? But with my web servers, I just want them to be separate from each other. I don't necessarily want to force that, but as a preference, I want them to be separated, okay? And so what I might do there is come in and change the way my host groups are defined. I might create a host group called, something like ESX host 01, okay? So I'm going to create a host group that's just going to have one host in it. It's just going to contain ESX host 01. And then I'll create another host group that just has ESX host 02. So I'm creating another host group called ESX host 02, and I'm only going to add my second host to it, just putting that second one in there, okay? And then I might do the same thing for my, my virtual machines, right? So I create a virtual machine group called Web01. It'll be a virtual machine group, and I'm just going to add Web01 to it. And I'll create another one called Web02, and I'm just going to add Web02 to it. All right. So I'm creating groups that correspond with my individual elements. All right. I know this seems a little counterintuitive, but I'm creating groups that match up with the individual elements. So now when I go and create a rule, I can add a rule, and I can say these are my web server, or I can say this is my Web01 rule. Okay. And I want Web01 to be a virtual machine to host rule, and I can say the Web01 group should run on hosts in the ESX host 01 group. Okay, so when Web01 gets balanced, it's going to try and stay on host 01. But it's a should. If host 01 is not available, it can move somewhere else. And I can add another one, which I'll call host 02, and I'll say virtual machines. I'm going to pick I shouldn't call it host 02, it should be Web02. And I'll say that it should run on hosts in ESX host 02. And now what's going to happen is whenever we do balancing, Web01 and Web02 are going to try and stay on host 01 and host 02 respectively. But if one node goes down, it'll allow them to move to the other side. And now Web01 and Web02 could be running on the same hardware. Now I've got that flexibility, right? It took a little doing, but because I wanted that should terminology, that's how I have to work around it. Okay, and we could say they should not run on these hosts. Maybe I don't want them to run on 10 gig hosts normally. So they shouldn't run on a 10 gig host. But if I run out of enough hosts, I may end up putting them on the 10 gig host just to make room. These rules are entirely up to you. You need to tweak them and customize them to meet the needs of your environment. Okay, now I probably could have achieved the same goal here without these DRS rules when I created the VMs if I just attached them to the host. And you can certainly do overrides on a host. Each one can be kind of set and overridden right on the virtual machine itself. So you've got the options to set that and get it put in place. And then right down here at the bottom, I've got one more thing which says vSphere HA can enforce VM host rules when restarting virtual machines. It's got the capability. But the default is to ignore the rules. Okay, so it's ignoring the affinity and anti-affinity rules by default when a virtual machine starts up. When a virtual machine starts up, it's going to go wherever it wants to go. And then it'll be up to DRS later to go and balance it. But you can tell HA to follow the rules when it boots up a VM. HA alone can't do balancing. It can't do what DRS does, but this would just be kind of a starting point. So if I want that, I can hit edit over here, and I can tell it, hey, when you start up a virtual machine, go ahead and apply the affinity and anti-affinity rules and make sure that you balance those out as best you can. Okay, and then the next time DRS runs, it will make sure that everything else gets balanced and put in place. All right. You've also got other little tweaks you can do, like when you go into VM overrides, you'll see where we can come in and specify VM overrides for them, and you've got the DRS automation level and the HA restart priority. You got a few different settings in here that all pertain to how that individual virtual machine is handled, so you can start to override those settings and modify it as needed. So you do have some flexibility with how you handle these, but the rules are kind of the key part, right? Getting those rules defined, and you may have a very straightforward environment where you can knock this out in 1 or 2 rules, or it might get more complex like what I showed, where you've got to create a number of groups and all that to support the rules to get them the way you want to influence the behavior. But for the exam, definitely remember should versus must. With the 2 main rules, keep VMs together and separate VMs, it's a must. They must be separate. And that can lead to situations where you have hosts that are online and VMs that are offline because they're not allowed to go together, right? But you can do shoulds if you do the 3rd type of rule where you're mapping virtual machines to hosts.
Don, I think it's interesting how when you say affinity, it's a lot more than just saying, okay, this virtual machine is going to stick on this host and you're staying there. So do appreciate you taking the time to explain that. It does look like we're coming to the end of another episode, but before we do you have any additional words before we sign out?
That's probably it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that that I want to mess with on this. There is something called SDRS, storage DRS. DRS by default looks at memory and CPU. It doesn't really pay attention to storage. And so there's an advanced licensed feature you can do called SDRS, storage DRS, where it'll actually look at disk I/O and balance things based on disk I/O. And that's important if you have database servers or things that are heavy disk intensity type stuff. So be aware that technology is out there. I don't think it's on the exam, but in real life, if you bump into SDRS, that's what it's talking about. It is a licensed feature. You can add it on, and it's got its own bells and whistles, but it's basically extending the functionality of the distributed resource scheduler.
Well, Don, as always, we do appreciate you being here, and we appreciate you, the viewer, for watching. Signing out at IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.